I'm very aware that most of you are unaware of Lewis Deep Democracy, so I'd like to take 2 minutes to describe what this organization does and how it blends into Professor Glasl's work and why we're the ones hosting him this evening for you.
Mm.
Um, so Lewis Deep Democracy in essence is around hearing all the voices, making sure that all the voices are given equal hearing and weight, that minority groups are included just as much as majority groups. And that inevitably, when different people give different viewpoints, there's going to be differences in those viewpoints. And it's there that part of the problem lies. We really find it difficult knowing how to handle differences of opinion. And often we feel it's more polite to keep quiet, to not say anything, or to gently agree, or for some of us to just really get angry and say what we want to say with not listening to others. As a result of not resolving the tension doesn't go away, but it rather increases. And inevitably, what may happen is that we may separate, at which time it's almost like we've lost. So when we separate from one another, there's a greater tendency for us to stereotype people, to demonize people, and eventually to go
Mm.
into violence. So for us in deep democracy, one of the most important factors is to stay connected. And we have a unique set of tools to help people remain connected in order that the transformation comes about as a result of the resolution of people staying together, the resolution of the tension, and leading to transformation of all people involved. I'd now like to introduce Professor Glasl and explain a little bit about what he does and how lucky we are to have him with us. So, for the last 55 years of Professor Glasl's life, he has been involved with the issue of conflict. He's been a researcher into conflict, and he's been primarily a mediator with conflict and promoting peace in very, very tough situations in Ireland, Israeli and Palestinian, and even in my own country in South Africa. But what we more want to focus on this evening is his work primarily with an organization called OSCE. It's the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which Russia is part of and is still part of. And this is the organization that we can look towards, which Professor Glasl has been involved with, in ways forward in this very awful situation that we're witnessing to, and for some of us, involved with. Professor Glasl has been very involved in the Russian issues as part of the Soviet Union have broken away. So, in relation to Georgia, in relation to Ukraine and other countries. So he's coming with not only understanding from an intellectual academic point of view, but also from personal experience, having worked in these areas. So we are very, very lucky to have him.
Thank you for the introduction and what you told about some of my activities related to conflict, peace, war aspects. My intention is neither to be in favor of this or this side, but to be in favor of the people and in favor of peace building and peacekeeping. I hope I succeed to give you an idea of what happened that led to this horrible aggression, to this horrible war, which was started then by Russian troops on the territory of the Ukraine. And I hope that also the ideas I can present on how to try to stop this and to de-escalate and to prepare the ground for peace talk, that this will make sense and that you can pick up several ideas and become active in your part of the world according to your possibilities, your opportunities, your relationships. One of my main areas in my research is the dynamics, the process of escalation. Very important thing is there is not a gradual, unnoticed process of intensifying. No, it is much more one of step by step, an aggravation. It gets more intense, more aggressive, more destructive. Become aware of the thresholds, because they give us a signal of take care, do not risk to pass the threshold, because if you have passed it, then the whole interaction becomes even more destructive, aggressive. So at step one, the hardening, that it starts when the communication is not so smooth as it has been before. Then people start with diplomatic notes, complaining, protesting, etc. The negotiations become more tense, but they're still going on. If the second step of the escalation can be observed, then you see that already people are exchanging more diplomatic notes of protest. Sometimes negotiations really are getting tougher and tougher, etc. Step 3 is escalating further. Then, of course, it's getting more difficult, it's getting more violent. And then you see how the parties become stereotypes. Then you behave to each other in a specific way in which you provoke, actually, I would say, negative behavior of the other party. And then they fight against this, not being aware of the fact that they have actually provoked it. If this goes on, if this is not stopped, and if you're not clarifying what is really going on and what is actually influencing the people's behavior, then the next step is that the escalation results in the loss of the credibility of the other party. You doubt the moral integrity, and in public, you dare to deny the moral integrity of the other side. But now, it is really that on the one hand, there are the good people, the virtue, and on the other side, on the other party side, there we see only the shadow side, the so-called immoral double of this person or this community. What is not going on if once you are convinced that the other party is not to be trusted anymore, then the other party has to fulfill your demands. Otherwise, you have to carry out sanctions, and so that the other party understands that this is not just a kind of a gesture of threat, but a real threat. You have also to show that you are able to carry out what you have promised as a sanction. And then the diplomatic relations usually are terminated, which means the direct communication between governments, states, moves to indirect channels of communication. And now 7 is that the sanctions, if the demands are not fulfilled, are then implemented, are carried out in a way that those who carry out the sanctions, they restrict themselves, they limit their destructive blows, and this is very important. They do not have the aim to destroy the other party completely, but it is, well, if I cause some damage here and there, and then perhaps you will surrender and you comply with my demands. So the way of thinking is that if you destroy 100 on one side, then I destroy 110 on your side. Some things which have been respected as values turn to the opposite. War virtues are by lying, by cheating, etc. I get some advantage. So it's quite a different logic. Then you can pass the threshold to step 8. That means the fragmentation of the enemy, the total destruction of the enemy, so that the other side really is actually not surviving, either in economic terms, in physical terms, or mentally, socially, or politically, or in cultural terms, etc. So the total destruction of the enemy. But I want to emphasize that when the war started in February this year with the invasion, it had the character of step 7, with the hope that maybe then the idea of establishing more self-government in Donetsk and Lugansk and more autonomy within the Ukrainian state, etc., and to demilitarize this again, that this can be achieved. But because of the violations of this, and because the requirement of the Minsk II treaty was that the Ukraine seriously is working on a constitutional reform to allow this to those regions, according to the Swiss model, actually, with the cantons of a high degree of sovereignty, of autonomy. But this was not achieved. The constitutional reform did not proceed as it should have done. So then the war actually escalated. Now we can observe it is really at step 8. And I hope that there is still a clear will and clear understanding that it would be completely a disaster if you would escalate any further, that you should actually do the best in order to get out of the step 8 of the escalation, to stop war, to stop violence, ceasefire, etc., through ceasefire, and with a perspective of peace talks and peace negotiations. Because the escalation to step 9 would actually mean that it's not any longer a regional thing, but that the conflict would also spread over other countries in Europe, and if the NATO would intervene, and. So horrible to imagine this. So it means really to gather into the abyss. When the parties in the conflict even dare to risk their own existence if they think that that's the only way to destroy the enemy. Before we get into questions and answers and discussion, to mention things which could, even now, could succeed in stopping and de-escalating and therefore preparing the ground for peace talks. So I'm talking about a dual strategy consisting of 1, emergency breaks, so immediate actions. There's a difference between truce and ceasefire. The truce can be negotiated immediately by the combatants in the field, in the battlefield, so to speak. You need not to involve then politicians from Kiev or from Moscow, etc. So they can agree the next 10 hours or 20 hours, there's a truce. A ceasefire is more. For negotiating a ceasefire, of course, these negotiations have been going on several times. You require that not only the combatants, but also political representatives are involved, this would enable then, of course, the politicians to enter into peace processes. And therefore, I am pleading for the multi-track diplomacy approach, which was developed about 30, 40 years ago by Louise Diamond and Joan McDonald's. But I continue a few things for immediate actions. Here in our countries, here in Europe, where refugees are coming from the Ukraine, for instance, at the university, we have students, Russian and Ukrainian students at the same university here in Austria, in Salzburg, where I'm living, or in Graz, where I work also with one of the universities. And the tragedy is that even now there starts some kind of tension among those people who are not at all part of the war system and of the parties of the conflict. They are just citizens, and they had good relationship before at the university, and they still have there. But there is a kind of a demonizing cloud coming over the people, and this is something which is, of course, produced by the demonizing work of psychological warfare and of media. And one has to be really aware of this, how easy it is that this is overcoming people. Yeah. And instead of this, friends of mine have organized, like in the university for music, etc., that Russian and Ukrainian artists are playing together, are giving a concert in favor of the victims of the war in the Ukraine. This is something which has a very important meaning. So we are not the enemies. Yeah? We are actually victims on both sides. Right. And we want to indicate this. We want really to demonstrate this. Yeah.
That's part of what we're about, is to try and spread as much as possible means to stay in relationship and connection. And there have been a few chats on messages on the chats about how we can be available. And one of the thoughts that came to my mind was that a real need to try and go into our own communities and continue spreading this concept of bringing people together as opposed to continuing to separate them. So it's almost doing the total opposite to what's happening in most of our communities around the world. Where we can bring this new message in a sense of how can we bring people together as opposed to continuing and even encouraging the separation through our own speaking and the way we interact with our communities.
From my side, Mena, I want to thank you for this opportunity, and I'm also grateful that people really are interested in considering what can we as ordinary people do, wherever we are in the world, what our place is. And as you said, if this attitude in the micro-social world, so really respecting different opinions, etc., and to try to understand, cognitive understanding, emotional empathy, and intentional empathy. This is a matter, this is a reality which also has an effect on the meso and on the micro-social level. And well, those who have access to people who can influence political decisions, etc., I hope they can become active and that people are listening to them. I am busy with that. Cannot tell you everything what I'm doing, but it keeps me busy really day and night. It's not exaggerated, day and night. And I hope that in spite of all what we have to see now, what we have to experience now, that morality and and common sense will still be the victors of that. Yeah. So thank you, and have a good night or good noon or good morning wherever you are in the world. And I hope perhaps in a few weeks we could share better news. Yeah.